All right, so let's get started here. So yeah, this crab. So this is an interesting example. This is a crab. It's a crab from Japan. It's called the Heike Crab, and it's So Eddie just said it. Looks like kind of a face, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the story behind this crab is that
I think it's just a little mistake.
the story about this crab is that scientists wondered, well, why does it look like there is like a face on this crab? It's called the carapace, on the back shell of this crab. And so we can actually use what we know about evolution to explain that. Now, these are a type of crabs that are typically used for food. That fisher people catch crabs,
I don't want that.
and they hold on one sec to that because that's going to be important. And so they catch crabs, they use them for food. So throughout thousands of years, as humans are catching these crabs, right? There's some variation in what the shells look like. For example, if you took you found a few turtles from a pond somewhere, is there a pattern on their shell all going to be exactly the same?
No.
No. It's going to be some variation, right? There are slightly different patterns because it's just sort of some randomness to the pattern that appears. Well, the same is true of lots of things, including the shell of these crabs. That is kind of random, the bumps and ridges that appear. But as people are fishing, catching dozens and dozens of crabs at a time, every once in a while they may catch one that looks kind of weird. If they caught a crab that kind of looks like, it doesn't have to look just like a human face, but it kind of looks like some sort of face. Eddie, what did you just say about that crab? You would not want to eat that, right?
Yes.
And so if you caught this crab, and even if it looks like kind of it maybe has like 2 eyes or something, maybe you say, I'm not going to eat this, what would you probably do with it then? Throw it back. And so when you throw it back, straight back there, when you throw that crab back into the ocean, what can it then do? Well, you didn't eat it, right? So it's still alive. And it could go about its little crab business and could eventually find a mate and reproduce. And probably, what are their offspring going to probably look like?
Like that?
Probably similar, right? Parents have offspring that have similar characteristics. And so the offspring probably are going to have a similar pattern. And then when people catch those, what do you think they do with them?
Throw them back.
Throw them back. And they can do what?
Make more.
Reproduce again. And so over thousands and thousands of years, the number of crabs that have these kind of strange shapes that look like a face will tend to go up because those are the ones. What happens to the ones that don't look like a face? What do people do?
Eat them.
They eat them. Can they reproduce? No, because they're eaten. So over time, humans are kind of influencing this species over time, and over time it changes. And so today, these crabs have a face that looks almost human-like on their shell. Okay? And again, that's the thinking behind how this happens. So we're going to be talking in this unit about how species change over time. And this is a good example because the way that evolution works is some individuals in a population have certain characteristics, certain traits that help them survive better. In this case, what trait did they have that helped them to survive?
Their face.
Their face-like shape. That helped them to survive. And so what happened to that trait over time? It became more and more common. Okay? And so this is how natural selection works, although it's not humans usually choosing, but it's nature, it's predators, it's food sources that influence this evolution. Sophia?
When you say like they can be similar but not like
Identical?
yeah.
Yep.
Isn't like in a child's
Yeah, that there's some variation over time. And certain variations, certain differences between turtles help certain turtles survive better than others. And over thousands of years, the species changed. So that's what evolution is. Evolution, when we say species evolve, when we are talking about this idea of evolution, we're talking about a species changing over time. And they talked about this in the video as well, that for a long time people thought that species did not change at all. They were created one way and they stay that way for all of eternity, for all of time. The theory of evolution tells us that species are not fixed. They don't stay one way for millions of years. They can change over time. They can, what we say, evolve over time. And this evolution can help us to explain, when we look around at all the species that exist on the earth, why are there so many different types of living things? Why is there such diversity? Why are there hundreds and hundreds of types of turtles? Why are turtles that live in similar areas similar to each other, but with certain differences? Okay. It can explain the wide variety of living organisms that we have on Earth. And so what we're going to talk about in this section of the unit is sort of, all right, well, how do we know this? How do we know that species change over time? How do we know they're not just the same, they've been the same forever? Okay. How do we know they change over time? How does that happen? How does a species actually change over a period of time? We'll talk about that. Okay? Again, here is another picture of that Heike crab. All right, so how do we know species evolve? Like they talked about yesterday in the video. Okay, for a long time, people thought species were always the same. Species that are here now have always been here, and the species that are here now will be here forever. But we know that that's not true because we have fossils. One of the things that Darwin was collecting was fossils. And we know fossils can tell us several things. And fossils can tell us, we find fossils like this trilobite. And those trilobites, they don't exist on Earth. They've never been found anywhere. They are a species that's gone extinct. Okay? We also can find fossils that show us sort of in between stages and steps. For example, horses. We're all familiar with horses. Well, millions of years ago, horses were small, sort of dog-sized mammals that had toes, not hooves. Okay? And how do we know that? Okay, there were no humans here 7 million years ago. Well, we know that by looking at fossils. Fossils, which are the remains of organisms, okay, they show us, we can find fossils from some 7 million years ago and see, hey, this is very similar to a horse, but much different than a horse today. And scientists have discovered fossils along the way. They show us the larger horse, the horse with 3 toes, a larger horse with 2 toes, an even larger horse with no toes, with hooves instead. And so they can see these sort of in-between stages. We call those transitional fossils. And that's one of the ways that we know species do change over time. They don't stay fixed. Another thing that helps us, yeah, Nick?
How could you tell if they're like what kind of animals they are?
Sort of by comparing them to animals that we know today. So you look at like the bones that they find in the fossils, and they compare those to bones of similar organisms today. We can also tell by looking at the body structure of different species. Okay? For example, if I look at a whale and a frog, a horse, a lion, a human, and a bat. Now, we may think a bat and a human and a whale, those are very different organisms, right? If you look at a human, a whale, and a bat, they look like 3, you would think they have very few similarities. But actually, when we look closely, the flipper of a whale, if you look inside of it, take away the fat, the muscle, what you would see are these bones.
Yes.
When you look in a human, we know human arm. We have upper arm bone, humerus. We have 2 forearm bones, the ulna and the radius. We have a series of wrist bones, and then a series of finger bones. If we look at a bat, the wing of a bat actually has these bones inside of it. So they're very similar, even though we may think a whale looks like some kind of fish versus a human. A bat looks like a bird. Okay? But when we look closely, they have very similar bones. Humerus, ulna, radius, wrist, fingers. Humerus, ulna, radius, wrist, fingers. Now there's different sizes, right? Some are elongated, some are shorter, but very similar. Now why are these all similar? That's the question we could ask. Sophia?
Because, like, can I just read the board?
I guess, I forgot it was up there.
Because they have evolved from a common ancestor.
Yes, because they are related in evolution. If we go back in the far distant past of the Earth, millions and millions of years ago, we would see that they had a common ancestor. Okay? And so they are related through evolution. And they have similar bone structure. Over millions and millions of years, each has changed and separated and become different from each other. But they do have a common ancestor at some point in the distant past, and therefore they have similar bone structure. Okay? Yeah, same sort of thing. You see alligator limbs, birds, turtles. And if we look at ancient fish fossils that we've seen, we see that these bones were there in a different configuration. Okay, some other ways we know species evolve and change over time is by looking at where species are located. What we see is if we look at an area, species in similar areas often have similar traits, similar characteristics. And when we get isolated islands, they tend to look much different than other species. Okay? If we look at, for example, Australia, an island, a large island, it's been separated from much of the mainland. And therefore, the species that were there on Australia, as they have evolved, they evolved differently from all the different species that are on the other continents. Okay, they're isolated, so they developed these unique adaptations. These are salamanders. And these salamanders migrated from Northern California down. Some went on along the coast. Some were in the Central Valley area. And what happened is they took sort of different evolutionary paths. Okay? The species that went through the Central Valley area, they became brightly colored. They evolved to mimic poisonous salamanders. The ones that moved down along the coast, they evolved to be a more camouflage color. Okay, so we can trace that. We can look at the DNA of different species. DNA are the molecules that make us who we are. And all species have DNA inside of their cells. And if we compare the DNA of two species, if it's similar, then they're closely related through evolution. And they had a common ancestor not too far in the past. If it's quite different, it means it was a longer time ago. If you think about you and, for example, your family. Who in your family do you think you have the most similar DNA with? Your siblings, your brothers or sisters. Okay? Who's your common ancestor of you and your siblings? Sophia? You and your siblings, you and Joe, and Ryan. Who's your common ancestor? Your parents. How about you have cousins? You have cousins, your first cousin. So are you as closely related to your first cousin as you are to your brother or sister? No. But you're still pretty closely related. If you look at your first cousin, who's your common ancestor? No, because your aunt is not your ancestor.
Oh.
Who's your common ancestor for you and your first cousin, Faith?
Your parents, like,
Yeah, but they're not related to you, Frank.
your parents' brother, sister.
No, because they're not your parent.
That's
Really? Your grandparents. So you have your parents. Your cousin is their parents. Their common ancestor were your grandparents, right? You and your first cousin have the same grandparents. How about your second cousin? Who's your great grandparents? Your third cousin.
great.
So again, once we go to third and fourth cousins, right? Are you that closely related, really? No, because we have to go farther in the past to find your common ancestor. The same is true when we think about evolution. It's the same kind of thing. Two species are closely related if you don't have to go back too far to find their common ancestor. Okay. All right, so this evidence tells us that over time species change. They evolve, we say. Okay? And the way this happens is through what we call the process of natural selection. In natural selection, you could think of it as how evolution happens. How do species change? What's the process? What's going on that causes horses to go from tiny little creatures to large creatures? So, if we think about an ecosystem where I have some mice. If you have mice in your field around your house, are they all identical to each other? No, there's variation. They're not identical. Some might be darker, some might be lighter. Their fur varies in color, just like people's hair varies in color. Okay? Well, let's say in this field, there's a few different types of mice with a variation in their fur. And there's a predator, a hawk. What's going to happen in this ecosystem to the mice that happen to be born with lighter fur? Olivia?
They're gonna die.
Why?
Because the bird's gonna eat them.
Yeah, they stand out. The bird's going to find them easier. It's going to eat them more often than it'll eat the dark mice.
Goodbye.
So, the dark mice therefore can do, what can the dark mice do? Nick?
Blend in.
They blend in and therefore they can don't survive. If they can survive, it means eventually they'll be able to
Do the same thing.
reproduce. When they have offspring, what are they going to be like? They're going to be a similar color, right?
Yeah.
And probably blend in more. How about these white mice? Are they going to survive as well?
No.
No. Are they going to reproduce as much?
No.
No. What's going to happen to the number of those white mice over a period of time? Nick?
There'll be no more.
It'll decrease and decrease until eventually maybe they're completely gone. And what we would say is this population of mice has evolved. It's changed over time. It went from being mixed fur colors to being all darker in color. So that species changed over time. And that's what natural selection says. Living things that are well adapted, that have good characteristics that are helpful, they survive more than others. And therefore, they reproduce. When they reproduce, they're passing on these good traits to their offspring. The ones that are not well adapted, they don't survive very well. They don't reproduce very much, and therefore, over time, the number decreases. So we call this natural selection. And natural selection just says that the individuals best adapted, best suited to their environment, can survive and reproduce and pass their genes, their traits on to the next generation. What we sometimes say, we call this survival of the fittest. Have you heard of that term?
Yeah.
But it's not survival of the strongest or biggest or fastest. So what is fittest? That's sort of a strange word. Why do we say survival of the fittest? Sophia?
Well, when I hear it, it's gonna sound kind of crazy, but I think of like I forgot what it's called, like turtle against the, when they had the race. What's that?
The tortoise and the hare?
Yeah, that. Well,
Go ahead, you make this connection, Sophie. I'm going to let there? So yeah, it means when we say survival of the fittest, what fittest means, it just means the one that is best suited to that environment. Now sometimes, depending on the ecosystem, depending on predators, depending on lots of factors, sometimes it might be good to be big and strong. But sometimes it might be more helpful to be small and fast. Okay? In that case, with predators, the smaller, faster individuals might be better suited. They might be the fittest. Sometimes it's the ones that are camouflaged are the fittest. Or sometimes ones that are brightly colored may survive better, and that's the fittest. So when we say survival of the fittest, what we're really saying is the survival of the best suited to that specific ecosystem, that specific situation. Sometimes it's big and strong, sometimes it's not. Okay, we'll finish up with this side. So any individuals that are not well adapted, you know, if you're a mouse in that field and you are born with some mutation that makes your fur bright fluorescent orange, well, you're probably not going to survive very long. And over a long period of time, these good traits, these beneficial traits, they become more common. Any trait that's harmful becomes less common. And if you continue that generation over generation over generation, the entire species changes. And that's what we call evolution. We also have species splitting off and forming new species through this process. And that's why we have so many different types of living things on Earth. All right, so we'll continue talking about evolution tomorrow. Good job today. Let me publish you to YouTube.